session as well. So we will be recording that. Again, it's an opportunity for you to share this after the event with your colleagues and make sure that we've got as many people as possible who are able to share Brigitte's valuable expertise. So I won't spend too much time talking at the moment. All I'll do is hand over to Brigette. Please, Brigette, take it away.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. This afternoon session, as Andrew mentioned, is about helping students to prepare for the speaking part of the PTE General. The examples that I will use in today's webinar are mainly focused on level 2, the B1 level. But if you do have any particular queries or questions relating to other levels of the exam, please feel free to put those in and we'll deal with them as best we can. We will also, once the whole series of webinars has come to an end next week, we will not only share the video links with you, but we'll also have summary sheets where we will be answering any questions in the chat that we didn't get time to get around to. So it's great to see so many people joining and from so many different countries. There's something really wonderful about you know, running a webinar where you've got people coming from all over the world. So thank you for joining us in that. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and because we've had some challenges on the quality of the internet connection, I'm going to take my video off for the duration of the presentation, and when we come back to questions at the end, I'll put my video back on again. So I'll just take my video off a second. And I'm just going to share my screen with you now. And if you would just be so kind as to confirm in the chat box to Andrew that you can see the screen in presentation mode, and that's clear for everybody before I get started.
Looks like it's a yes, Brigette. Everyone can see the screen.
Great. Okay, I'll make a start then. So Andrew's very kindly introduced me, and I feel like I've got a lot to live up to now from that introduction. I've been working with Pearson in Italy for the past 20 years, and I've been involved in Pearson EdXL English language qualifications in Italy for the last 8 years or so, basically in a capacity of helping set up test centres, training centre managers, exams officers, and teachers who are preparing students as well. That's just a little bit about me. I'll just make a slight change to the information that Andrew shared with you, just because people often want to put comments or flag if they have any difficulties with the quality of audio, etc. in the chat. It might be helpful if the questions actually go in the Q&A panel, so it's easy for Andrew to separate the questions away from any other general comments that you would like to make. And as Andrew mentioned, we will be recording today's session. All those recordings then will be available after the 5th of May when we finish this round of webinars. The things that we'll be looking at today, because we've got quite limited time, so I'm going to look at the structure of the test. I'm going to look at what the objectives of each task are and what the stimulus is, what the question type is, what students can expect in terms of the question types. We'll look at tips for preparing students, and in that sense I'll go through each individual part of the exam with specific tips for the specific tasks that come up. We'll then just take a quick look at practice materials that are available, and then we'll move on to a question and answers session. So I'll make a start now. Before I actually go into the structure of just the speaking test, as I know some centres are relatively new to working with the Pearson Test of English suite of exams, I did just want to just quickly do an overview of what is in the whole exam, if you like, because as you will know, Pearson Test of English assesses all 4 skills, and everything to do with the writing test, so the listening, reading and writing, have either been covered in last week's webinars, and in particular in relation to the scoring, you will find a couple of webinars that really dig into the detail of how those tasks are scored. On Monday, we had a webinar from David Booth on developing reading skills, students' reading skills. Tomorrow, David will be wrapping up the individual skills webinars by focusing on the writing. So if you're interested in getting tips for developing students' writing skills, that's tomorrow with David. And then the listening, the speaking paper, the speaking paper scoring information was covered in a series of webinars by Aline Boundy last week. So looking at all 4 tasks in the speaking paper. So if you want more detail on the scoring, we will mention it briefly today, but today's focus really is on preparing students rather than digging into the detail of how the test is scored. So if that's what you're interested in, then please do watch out for those webinars when we share the recordings. So let's move on then and start to look at the actual speaking test in a little bit of detail. So the first thing to take on board is that the exams are conducted on a one-to-one basis. The examiner is not as such an examiner. In the Pearson Test of English, we have interlocutors who conduct the exam, but they do not score them. So the exams are recorded and they are then corrected. Those recordings are corrected by examiners in the UK. So just so that you, for those of you who are new to the exams, you're aware of how the exams are actually set up. The other thing to say is that whereas the written exam takes place on a specific date determined by Pearson, the speaking test can take place up to 15 days prior to or on the day of the written test. So there's a bit more flexibility with the date of the speaking paper, should you need to stagger the days in which you run exams. So PTE General Speaking then has 4 parts to it. 4 parts if you're working from levels 2 upwards. So by that I mean from level B1 to C2. If you have candidates who wish to take the A1 or level 1 task, their speaking test will be made up of 3 parts. So as you can see from the slide I have here, the discussion task, which is the second one, is something that only presents itself in levels 2 to 5, as students at A1 and level 1 don't have the linguistic competence to engage in a debate with the interlocutor. So the task types are, first of all, a sustained monologue on personal information. Secondly, then, in section 11, a discussion. Thirdly, describing a picture task. And finally, at the end in section 13, a role play. The duration of the speaking test varies across the level. And just to point out that the duration you see here refers to the time after the examiner has done the first initial introduction, where they are introducing themselves by name and surname, their test centre number, their examiner code, and the student's name, surname, and candidate number. So the 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes really start from the time the examiner starts on the first task. I'm going to look now then section by section as to exactly what the objective of each of the individual tasks are, just so that we've got a clear idea. Is if we're preparing students, it is obviously important that we've got clear in our own minds how that task will be assessed. So in the first part, the sustained monologue about personal information, it's all in the title there really. The sustained monologue means that the test taker really needs to speak uninterrupted in a response to a main prompt that is given by the interlocutor. And depending on the level, the duration of that sustained monologue will vary across the levels. So I'll come to what those durations are in a moment, but at level 2, it's up to about, I think, 50 seconds. There are follow-up questions that the interlocutor can use with a candidate should they run out of steam before having reached the duration that they should have been speaking for. But really the best case scenario here is for candidates to be able to respond to the main prompt and for the duration that is required. So we'll look when we get into the tips section what kind of strategies you can help to train your students in order to ensure that initial response to that first prompt is of the length that is required. In these main prompts, then candidates could be asked questions that focus on something to do with their present circumstances, with regular and routine activities, with past activities or future plans. But as personal information would suggest, they're all within the realm of topic areas related to everyday life. So it could be holiday, it could be sport, it could be school, it could be a variety of things, but nothing, let's say, abstract or far removed from the student's everyday life, if you like. The other thing to mention here is that when we actually come to the question type, so here you've got some examples of what the questions may be about. The interlocutor is also trained to take into consideration the candidate that they have in front of them. So they are careful not to ask, you know, a teenage candidate something about a job, for example, or to be asking an adult candidate about school, etc. So there's a variety of prompts for the interlocutor to work with that are relevant to the candidate that they have in front of them. Here we have then an example taken from a level 2 paper with some main prompts. You can see at the top of this section, there's a guide for the interlocutor as to how long that, that section should last. And at level 2, the candidate should really be speaking from between 40 and 50 seconds. So given that there's a minute and a half, should a candidate run out of steam quickly, you see there's always a series of follow-up prompts that can be used. But really the ideal scenario is that the candidate speaks from 40 to 50 seconds from the main prompt. So I've put up the other levels in terms of what is expected, in terms of the duration, if you like. So you can have a sense, depending on the level you're most interested in, how long the candidate should be speaking for. We'll move on then to the discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a task that comes from level 2 upwards. And here we are, from the level 2 descriptor, we are looking to assess the candidate's ability to discuss a concrete issue. And test takers really need to be able to engage in turn taking in this particular task. And they're given a topic to respond to, a prompt to respond to by the interlocutor, and they need to take turns in supporting one or other sides of the argument in the main prompt. I think one thing to mention here is that candidates are now moving away from the language of personal information. So it's important that the language and the register that they use when they're doing the discussion task is not in the realms of personal information. So we're not looking for their likes and dislikes and personal preferences, but rather we're looking for them to be able to state which side of the argument they would support, and then to really argue their case in that sense. So here we have the style of question, the kinds of things, the example topics, again for level 2. And so we're looking at a variety of different concrete topics, if you like, rather than just personal experience and personal preferences. And here we have an example of the discussion task at level 2. Here you see the task lasts longer, it's 2 minutes. There isn't a minimum amount of time that the candidate should be speaking for as they argue one side of the argument, so to speak. But they are expected to really engage with the examiner in a more formal way, because the discussion task is set up in a more formal way. So we would expect a more formal register to be used. And it's really to ensure that they do follow on naturally to the things that the examiner is using as a prompt. So at this point, it'll become important to train students to have those stock phrases to get them started. I think this task can be one of the most challenging ones for students, particularly teenagers who may not be culturally used to arguing a point with an authority figure like an examiner, for example. So I think it's important that candidates are also prepared in that the examiner expects them to take a side of the argument, and that is exactly what is expected of them, so to speak, and that they're able to kind of take on the examiner's opinion. So you have a point, but I agree with you to a point, but etc. That you get that natural backwards and forwards between turn taking between the examiner and the candidate. Section 12 then, describing a picture. This is again to assess the ability to speak continuously about a picture and interpret some aspect of it. And so here test takers are speaking without interruption about a picture in response to the prompt that's given by the interlocutor, up to about 45 seconds. And this is followed by a second instruction where the candidates are invited to interpret an aspect of the picture. The picture then will show a scene or a sequence of events. This is at level 2. At level 3, candidates will be given 2 pictures where they'll be required to create some connection between the two, to contrast the two. But at level 2, the picture is just one that they need to look at. And the picture will always contain then some elements that invite comment or interpretation. And if we look at an example, you'll see exactly what I mean here. So here we have a picture of people in the theatre. Once the candidate has described that, then they are invited to tell the examiner how the people are feeling and what is going to happen next. So there needs to be an element of interpretation from the candidate, and that they put their own personal reaction, if you like, to what they see. The final task then is the role play. And here the objective is to assess their ability to perform and respond to language functions appropriately. You see again this example coming from level 2, a variety of different language functions. And the aim here is really to assess the test taker's ability to perform language functions that may be required in situations other than just in the speaking test. And I think that's a really key point about Pearson Test of English General task types. What you find with the Pearson Test of English task types, and I think this also comes up with the other skills as well, is if we sort of discard the multiple choice activities, then really we are training students to do things that will serve them beyond the day of taking the test. So we're really there to assess their ability to communicate in English, not just their knowledge of the system of the English language, so to speak. So the test taker in this task may be required to negotiate a minor difficulty, for example, declining an invitation or apologizing. They may be required to make a complaint that comes up, for example, at one of the other levels. So it's as much as possible set in an everyday life situation, so something that is of use to the student. The stimulus then is via a role play card. So the candidate will be given a role play card by the interlocutor. They'll have 15 seconds to read it, and the role play card will give an explanation of the situation and the role, so what character the examiner is playing, and then there will be instructions and or an objective for the candidate to meet as they work their way through the role play. There will be visual support if that's appropriate. That will also depend on the level, but essentially the candidate will have that 15 seconds to just familiarize themselves with the context, who the examiner is, and look at the key points they need to get across. And depending on the level of the speaking exam, those prompts on the role play card will either be very prescriptive at the lower levels, or as you gradually work up beyond the B1 level, beyond the level 2, will become more open and with just a general objective to achieve without, necessarily key bullets to work through. So up to the candidate to really, engage with the examiner and get to the objective required. So here we have an example of a role play, again from level 2, where the candidate is taking the role of a friend who's due to meet another a friend outside the theatre, and the examiner is playing the friend who's outside the theatre, and the candidate is the friend who is late. Here you see you still have bullet points, so it's fairly prescriptive, as I say, as they work up the level over and above the description of the context of the role play. Those bullet points will start to disappear, and it will be just an overall objective or description of what needs to be achieved. So I'll move on now then to some speaking task tips. I'll start off with just some general tips, and then we'll move in section by section. So the first thing to say here, I think, is that it's important that students become familiar with the duration of the test, both in its entirety and the individual parts, and how long they're expected to speak for, particularly in the extended speaking tasks, so in section 10 and in section 12, where they're speaking uninterrupted, if you like. Because knowledge of this and how long they have to speak at each part of the in each part of the test will help them to manage their language production, let's say, more effectively, because they know roughly how long they've got to speak for, and it can help them focus. When you're preparing students then, it's important that you give them plenty of practice in doing these activities in the required time, so that becomes quite a natural thing for them. Ensure that they are then familiar with the format of the test and what is required in the individual activities, so that they are that they learn how, if you like, to unpack the question that the examiner is asking them. When we looked at the listening test yesterday, I mentioned that it's a good idea for students to take a highlighter in to highlight keywords. When we come to the speaking test, candidates can't take a highlighter into the exam with them, but we do need to train them to listen for keywords in the examiner questions, so that they are really aware of what is being asked of them, and they don't answer going off on a complete tangent, which may be grammatically correct and show a range of vocabulary, but may not be answering the question that's been asked of them. So important that they're familiar with the format and what is required in the individual activities. And then the other thing I would say is to train students to get off to a good start, because the speaking exam, it may not be the skill that they find most difficult, but it's often when they feel most nervous, because they're coming into a room, into a one-to-one context. The examiner is somebody that they don't know. And so when you are nervous, one of the first things that betrays that nervousness, in a sense, is that your voice shakes and you can't sort of you can't steady your voice. So if we train candidates to get off to a good start by coming in and greeting the examiner, good afternoon, my name is, and even before the recording is started or anything of that nature, that they just feel they're going in with something to say, and they just somehow regain that control of the situation, if you like, and just feel a little bit more at ease. So that would be, in terms of general tips, that they would be my suggestions. When we move on then to preparing the personal information part of the exam, here candidates are going to be asked a prompt that in some way relates to personal information. And in order to ensure that the candidates can showcase a range of vocabulary relating to personal information topics, one idea that you could use, and I think this works particularly well with teenagers, as this generation of students are very much visual learners, is to work on mind mapping vocabulary to personal information topics. You have the functions and notions documents on the website that will tell you the vocabulary areas that could be, and the topic areas that could be addressed in the exam. And one way to help your students then to ensure that they can bring in different aspects of a main prompt is to mind map with vocabulary, so that they can add different elements to a general personal information topic. That then becomes also a convenient way to store that vocabulary, and if they need to kind of revise it before the exam, then it's all sort of on one page, organised in a way that's intuitive to follow. Another suggestion for personal information is that, as I mentioned before, it's important that the examiners have a satisfactory sample of language to assess. So if the language that they are using, and if their monologue doesn't go on for long enough, then that is problematic, in that they need to have reached a certain duration in terms of their speaking. So what really we need to work on is ensuring that test takers provide an answer to a main prompt that consists of more than just a few words or just one sentence, And so one way to do that is to train students to give reasons for their response to the prompt. We have an example on the screen here where the main prompt is, can you tell me something about which clothes are in fashion at the moment, or where do you buy your clothes? This candidate is answering, I buy my clothes in the market because it's much cheaper there. I meet my friends and we shop together. Also, the market has a lot of clothes I like. So rather than just stopping at I buy my clothes in the market, there are reasons given to why the student buys their clothes in the market, and they go from one just what would be a very short response to actually being able to sustain that monologue for another sentence and a half. And so the more we train them to give reasons for their responses, we are really helping them just extend the length of the monologue that they're giving. So that can also, over and above just increasing the duration of how long they're speaking for, it will also give them a chance to showcase potentially different grammatical structures or a wider range of vocabulary. So that's a good habit to get them into. Coming back to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of really understanding what the examiner is asking you, it's important that we get the candidates to mentally highlight and unpack what the examiner is asking. So when the examiner, this is at a lower level, is asking a candidate, what time do you finish work? The good thing about picking out the keywords is that they will be the words that are stressed, because native speakers tend to stress the information words and maybe not the other words. So just getting them to focus on those keywords and really encourage them to listen carefully and pick out exactly what they're being asked. So in that sense, then the candidate will give an answer that is relevant to what is being asked. So it's important that we train them to listen carefully and to unpack that. This is an example taken from one of the higher levels. So for example, this is an example taken from one of the 2 to 5 level exams. And you see here, what career advice would you have liked to receive? And the test taker is really interpreting that question and unpacking that question and saying, the examiner is asking me about the advice I didn't get, but that I think would have helped me choose a job if I had received it. So really important that they don't feel a pressure to respond without taking the time to have digested the question. We're not expecting the candidate to start speaking the minute the examiner finishes the prompt. It's quite normal for a candidate to take a couple of seconds to digest what they've heard in order to organize their thoughts, if you like, and then to start answering. In the discussion section, which is the one, as I mentioned, only there from levels 2 to 5, it's important that we train students to move from the realm of personal information into more general topics, potentially concrete topics, or sometimes even more abstract topics. But certainly here we are moving away from areas such as their likes, their dislikes, personal habits and preferences. And we, in order to do this, need to equip them with a range of introductory phrases that will steer them towards these kinds of topics. So stock phrases like, I think that, I believe that, I'm convinced that, as I see it, in my opinion, from my point of view. And we move away from, I like, I prefer, etc. And we stick with a more formal register used in a discussion, in a debate. Again, it's important that candidates really understand what is being asked of them. And the discussion task can be a task if students just dive into choosing something, that they can go off on a tangent because they haven't unpacked what the examiner is saying to them. And the instruction here is obviously slightly longer because now we're going to discuss something together. The question is it better to shop in markets or in supermarkets? What do you think? So there's quite a lot for them to listen to. It's important that we train them to, again, pick out the keywords and really think, what do I need to do here? So in the first one, I need to compare these two types of place to shop. Or in the second one, I need to argue for traditional or modern festivals and to look at the pros and cons of each, and so on and so forth. So listen carefully to the examiner's question, decide which approach to take, and if they understand the focus of the question, they are more likely to produce a relevant answer and to employ in appropriate structures and vocabulary. So really important to just take the time to be sure that they've understood exactly what is being asked. And there's absolutely no harm in asking the interlocutor to repeat the question if they feel they just need to hear it one more time to be sure. When we're on to describing a picture, in Aline's webinar last week, she talked about the importance of teaching students stock phrases to get them started with describing the picture, and that, you know, they have if you like, models to rely on from that point of view. When it comes to the follow-up question, it's important that the candidate really listens to what the question is asking. So in this particular question, you've got, please tell me what you can see and what is happening in the picture. So you're being asked in a way to answer both in the present simple tense and in the present continuous. So because that is what comes up in the question, the use of those structures in the answer would be expected, because in that sense you are then answering the question. So I've got a couple of example answers to that. So you've got a couple of sentences here in the present simple and one in the present with the present continuous. The same here as well. Okay. In level 2 to 5, and this I believe is from a level 3 exam, because you have two pictures here. You see candidates are asked what they see in two pictures. Please tell me what you can see in the two pictures. It's important that students speak about the sort of the global ideas of what they see in these pictures, but also that they can create a connection and contrast what they see in the pictures as well. So working through those three areas, sort of a global description, what they have in common and what is different about them, should give them enough scope to speak for the sustained period that is required at the level. We have another example here as well. In this picture, please tell me how the people are feeling and what you think is going to happen in a minute. So here students would need to also support a point of view. And to that extent, it's important that we train students with linking words so they can say, I believe, I think, I feel, I would argue, I would suggest, because, and then they look for evidence in the picture to support why. So linking words, an important element to focus on for the pictures. Moving on then to section 13, the role play. Firstly, it's important that students really take advantage of the 15 seconds that are afforded to them, because that's their thinking time. They're entitled to that, and nobody expects them to jump in beforehand. So they should take the time to calmly read through their test taker's card and be really clear on what they need to do, what they need to develop in terms of sentences, questions, etc., to engage in the role play. Sorry, that slide got stuck then for a second. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay. Important that they also pay attention to the role of the examiner in the role play. So when they're reading the initial prompt, so here, for example, you are in the office of one of your teachers. Your teacher wants to discuss why you haven't handed in your homework recently. The examiner is your teacher. Depending on the role that the examiner is playing, that should indicate to you something about the register and your behavior in the role play. So if you're going to complain, you might be slightly more angry. We don't expect students to suddenly become actors during the role plays, but I think having an awareness of the context and the role of the examiner is something that will help guide students in the type of register that they use when they're engaging in the role play. So it is important that they do pay attention to whether it should be a more formal or a less formal register, because that shows their socio-linguistic awareness and how they deploy language according to the context in which they're communicating in. We'll just look quickly then at some sources for practice activities. I know that it's always a challenge to increase student speaking time in lessons, and particularly when you're teaching large groups of students. So if I were to recommend anything in terms of a course book for preparing students, the SpeakOut course book, which I also mentioned yesterday for the work on listening, because SpeakOut does have a tremendous range of listening practice activities. And as you will have seen as I've worked through these tips, listening carefully is as equally an important part of the speaking exam as it is in the written exam. It's not formally assessed in the speaking exam, but it can condition a candidate's performance if they haven't listened carefully and they're not answering the question in the way they should have. But SpeakOut, as the name would suggest, is a course that's designed to get students speaking. So for those of you who have students who are not at the language level they need to take the test, and they need language development work, so you're looking for something that you can use over an academic year, this is one that I would strongly recommend. We obviously have the Skills Boosters series for those of you who want to do exam style practice, and we've just recently uploaded some more practice tests on the PTE website as well if you're looking for new practice test material. And in July, we will be publishing a series of practice tests, practice test plus books. So they will go from levels A2 through to levels C1. They contain 5 complete practice tests. There's a practice app coming out soon as well, and there's obviously all the audio material. There's a version for teachers with an answer key, or if you want to give your students the version with an answer key. And in these particular books, you also have a grammar bank of activities as well. So it's not just a series of what look like past papers to work through, but it really is guided practice to take you through all the different aspects of the exam. Just wanted to say just a few words about the webinars that are coming up in the next couple of days. So David Booth, our Test Development Director, will be covering the last of the skills related webinars tomorrow, focused on writing. And then on Friday, Bartek will be running a webinar on revision strategies for students. And then in the early part of next week, we have 2 webinars dedicated to giving you some tips and suggestions for coping with the stress of teaching students for exams, and for students in terms of studying for exams as well. So that's what's coming in the next couple of days. We'll move now then to questions and answers, and if Andrew would be so kind to
yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Sharing my screen, and I'll put the video back on as well, because I feel very detached from you without video. Okay.
Thank you, Brigette. That was wonderful. So yes, everybody, thank you so much for sending your questions through. I've got some really good questions so far. Please do feel free, if there's anything on your mind, to just add them to the question and answer tab as we go through. So an interesting question from Gosha. Are test takers given their own arguments, or can they provide their own arguments in the discussion section? So are they mandated to argue from a certain point of view, or do they have a free choice?
No, so the interlocutor will have prompts for both sides of the argument, because the interlocutor needs to respond to the candidates choosing which side of the argument they agree with. So it's up to the candidate to formulate their own side of the argument. The interlocutor will have some prompts both for a given argument and against it, and depending which side the candidate takes, the interlocutor will take the opposite side of the argument. One thing that is important when candidates engage in that sort of turn-taking and discussion with the examiner is that they really stick to their side of the argument, that they don't then come over to the examiner's side, and then you risk going round and round in circles. So fine for the candidate to take on board the opinion of the examiner. In fact, I think that's a good thing, because it shows that you'll take on board somebody else's opinion, but then bring it back to your view. And
that's great.
One more thing to say on that is candidates are not in any way judged as to whether they really believe what they're saying. Candidates often ask, but I haven't got an opinion on this. For the exam, you need to formulate an opinion. So whether you really believe that opinion or not is not a problem. The important thing is that you engage with the task, and that you argue one side of the argument.
That's great. Thank you, Brigette. A question from Ziamara. In that first section, the fewer questions, the follow-up questions, the better. Is that true? So if the learner can speak uninterrupted for the full minute, is that preferable? Is it better to have fewer follow-up questions and more follow-up questions?
Yes, in as much as a candidate is really required to speak for that length of time. It is a sustained monologue, so follow-up prompts should really be used if a candidate dries up very quickly and has nothing else to say. If, however, we train our students by training them to think of reasons as to why they're answering that prompt, then hopefully that will be sufficient to get them through the duration that they need to be speaking for. So better, if you can, to respond to the first prompt fully.
Thank you, Brigette. Another question that's come through. In section 13, if a student doesn't know a word, can they ask the interlocutor? Can they kind of raise a question with the interlocutor as to the meaning?
So an interlocutor can't, let's say, help a student in terms of understanding. What I would suggest, what I would suggest happens if a candidate doesn't know a word, and I'm not sure really if you're referring to something on the test taker's card or when they're actually speaking, they're at a loss for a word. If it's the latter, I would always encourage candidates to just try and describe around the word they can't recall. One activity, I didn't mention it in today's, but it's a very useful one, is to train students to think of descriptions for words. So they get in the habit of, if they're missing that word, and honestly, when they're in an exam, if they're a little bit nervous, even relatively well-known vocabulary can be elusive in that kind of situation. So if they can get into the habit of just describing around the word, that's absolutely fine. As long as the communication continues, then that's fine.
Thank you. A question from Jacqueline. Do students have time to look at the photos before starting to speak?
So there's not a sort of a dedicated amount of time in the way you've got the 15 seconds for the role play. I don't think anybody expects the candidate to kind of start speaking the minute the paper touches the desk, so to speak. But certainly they shouldn't be taking sort of 30 seconds to look at the picture and make up their mind about what they're going to say. So, you know, being reasonable, they should start as soon as possible after the picture has been given to them.
Thank you.
They generally do, I have to say. They generally do start speaking.
A question from Alejandra. How can they get the Practice Test Plus books when they're released?
So the practice test books are going to be published in July. I would suggest you contact your local Pearson education consultant. If afterwards you will have registered, we can find out who that is for you if you don't know who your local consultant is. But they will have information about that because they're published via Pearson ELT, English Language Teaching.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Bridget. Now, does anybody have any other questions before we wrap up? Just give everybody a minute to type those questions in if you do have them. Well, perhaps we can hand over to Bridget for some closing words, some final last piece of advice.
Okay. I mean, really, I think I've said all I had to say in terms of what I plan to say today. All I would say is that if you would like any sort of further training or more detailed training, when we release the recordings, we will ask for feedback on, you know, this first initial round of webinars that we've done. And, you know, we're certainly prepared to take this forward and look at things that are of interest to you. So I would say consider what we're doing now as a starting point rather than a finishing point. 40 minutes isn't a lot of time to go into a lot of detail. So if there are certain things that weren't answered today, do let us know what, you know, either reach out to your local Pearson consultant or when we send those webinars to you, because you will have registered with an email address to join today's webinars, then please do engage with us. We're happy to support you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well said, Bridget. One small point of question from Gosha. Could you clarify how long in the role play the learners have to prepare?
It's 15 seconds.
15 seconds. That's fantastic. And again, really just to echo what Bridget has said, thank you so much for everybody who's joined. We've had some really interesting questions, some wonderful feedback in the chat. Thank you so much to Bridget for a really excellent, informative presentation. I've been working for Pearson for 15 years and I certainly learned a few things myself. So really, really helpful. And as we've been saying, these presentations are recorded, so you will have the opportunity to share them with friends and colleagues after the series has ended. So unless there's anything else, we will close this down now. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow for the next set of presentations.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.